My name is Ethan. I'm 41. Last week, my brother, the CEO of our family company, mocked me in front of clients for asking to help an old neighbor with $150. He laughed. Everyone did. What he didn't know was that I held a signed directive from our grandfather giving me the power to move $4.2 billion legally. So that's exactly what I did, and I didn't do it for revenge. I did it for everything he forgot. I walked into the meeting room that morning trying to keep my head down. Chicago's winter light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Cole Group headquarters, casting a pale glow on the polished mahogany table. I adjusted my tie, took a deep breath, and tried to focus on the agenda. But I already knew what was coming. Ryan stood at the head of the table, flipping through the presentation deck, a smirk playing on his lips. He cleared his throat and addressed the room loudly enough that clients and board members could hear. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. I had asked for a small advance, just $150, to help Mr. Reed, an elderly neighbor whose roof was caving in. I didn't ask because I needed it. I asked because nobody else would. Then Ryan spoke. His voice echoed. He said if a chief financial officer was reduced to begging for a roof repair, maybe we had hired the wrong person. He mocked me, called me a joke in front of everyone. He asked who would ever trust a company led by someone who can't even afford basic kindness. The room filled with snickers. I felt eyes on me, shifting, sizing me up, waiting for me to crack. But I stayed still. I left without saying a word past colleagues whose faces flickered with pity or discomfort. I walked to my office, each step echoing in the hall's sterile quietness. The door shut behind me. I took off my jacket, draped it over a chair, and sat. My hands were steady, but my heart hammered. My desk was simple, uncluttered, just my laptop, a few financial reports, and a small safe built into the desk. I slid back the panel, lifted the lid, and reached inside. My fingers brushed over the cold metal of an envelope and a thick folded document titled Emergency Capital Directive. It was signed and dated 2018 in my grandfather's hand. I unfolded the pages carefully, tracing the signature. My grandfather, Henry Cole, had always seemed larger than life. Founder of this company. My father died when I was young. Grandpa raised me, trusted me. I had been invisible to most, but he knew. He knew my patience, my quiet loyalty, my willingness to stay while others shouted. In that document, he granted me an unusual right, a right to act, if the integrity of the family and company were ever betrayed. I placed the paper down, closed the safe, and sat back, letting the heavy silence fill the space. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The hum of the air conditioning motor whispered behind walls. I exhaled, barely audible. I wondered what the board would think. I wondered how far Ryan would push me. I thought of Mr. Reed's house, how rain would leak through the cracks, how no one else cared. I thought of my grandfather's faith. They think I'm irrelevant. They think I'm weak. But they forget I hold the key they never imagined I'd use. I grew up in the shadows of people who believed noise meant power. After my father died in a car crash when I was 9, my mother packed her grief and moved to Sarasota, leaving me with my grandfather in Evanston. She said I'd be better off learning from the man who built the Cole Group from the ground up. Back then, I didn't understand what that meant. Now I do. Grandpa Henry was a quiet force, never the loudest in the room, but always the one people listened to when it mattered. He'd sit at the breakfast table sipping his coffee, circling numbers in the Wall Street Journal while telling me that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you preserved. He raised me in the same house he bought in the 70s, the walls lined with framed documents and faded photos of a company that began in a single garage and grew into a national investment powerhouse. In 2015, I was finishing my MBA when news hit that Ryan and Natalie had leveraged company resources to quietly sabotage a tech startup our firm was vetting. I remember reading the memo, the language sterile, clinical. But I knew the truth. That startup had potential. Ryan saw it as a threat to our own holdings, and Natalie spun the PR narrative. They buried it. Grandpa didn't say much at the time, but I saw the way his jaw clenched. He logged the betrayal silently, as he always did. 3 years later, he called me into his home office. His hands shook more than usual that day. I remember the legal pad open beside him, half a crossword filled in. He pushed a heavy envelope toward me and said if ever I felt the company's soul was being sinned, I had the authority to act. The document inside was a full legal directive drafted and notarized. It granted me the right to reallocate funds from the Blue Rock Fund, a financial backbone of the coal group, if ethical standards were breached. He trusted me not because I fought for control, but because I never wanted it. In 2019, Ryan and Natalie orchestrated a board vote to restructure executive ownership. They used company pressure to make me sign away my seat. I was given a script paraded in a meeting and handed a ceremonial plaque as CFO Emeritus. Most would have fought. I smiled, shook hands, and left the room. What they didn't know was that I kept the original directive sealed in a private file, untouched but never forgotten. They built towers of glass and steel while I archived words written on thick, creased paper. The world moved forward: quarterly reports, investor calls, acquisitions. Ryan basked in headlines, Natalie dominated panels on corporate governance. I became invisible, but that was fine, because sometimes being invisible is the best way to watch things unravel. I still remember Grandpa's voice in that hospital room, the faint smell of disinfectant and old paper mixing in the air. He could barely lift his hand, but managed to press it over mine and said, "There's no virtue in shouting louder than liars. But if they ever trade our values for power, you take it back, not for revenge, for who we were." I left that room holding his words like scripture. And now, sitting in my office years later, the directive beside me and the mockery still fresh in my ears, I knew exactly what I had to do. The drive to Springfield was quiet, just the steady hum of the tires and the occasional gust of wind pressing against the windows. I kept my eyes on the road, a white envelope resting in the passenger seat, with exactly $150 in cash inside. It wasn't much, but it wasn't about the money. It was about a promise. Mr. Samuel Reed lived in a small, weather-worn house tucked at the edge of a street that used to be proud. Now the paint peeled off fences, mailboxes leaned crooked, and silence hung heavier than it should. I parked at the curb, stepped out into the cold, and walked up the cracked steps to the porch. He opened the door before I knocked. His eyes were sharp despite the years, but the lines on his face ran deeper than I remembered. He was wearing a faded University of Illinois sweatshirt and held a mug that smelled faintly of peppermint tea. He recognized me immediately and smiled. "You look just like Henry did at your age," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The house was clean but tired. The ceiling in the living room had a clear water stain, the corners sagging slightly. I glanced up, then back at him. "How bad's the roof?" He shrugged like it didn't matter. "It's lived through worse. I patch it when I can." I handed him the envelope. "Just take it. No questions." Grandpa would have wanted it. He looked down, then back up. "I know what Henry would have wanted, but you don't owe me anything, son. Not a dime." I sat down on the edge of the couch. "You saved the company in 1985. Everyone forgets, but I don't. You helped restructure the debt when no bank would touch us. Without you, Coal Group never would have made it through the crash." He waved a hand. "I was just doing my job, But Ryan doesn't think so, does he? I didn't answer. He said what he said, Mr. Reed continued. A couple years back, I went up to the office, thought I'd surprise the old gang. Ryan saw me in the lobby and called me an old liability, told HR not to let me back up without clearance. I left before he had the chance to say it twice, my fists clenched, but I forced a breath. Well, I'm not Ryan. He smiled again, softer this time, then reached over and pushed the envelope back into my hands. If you're anything like your grandfather, you'll understand this ain't about money. It's about respect. And if you still got that, you're richer than most. I drove back to Chicago in silence. No radio, no podcasts, just the wind in my thoughts. By the time I reached the parking garage, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows between the concrete pillars. Back at my desk, I logged into the administrative console of our financial platform. My access to Blue Rock Fund remained active as it always had. On the surface, it was just another diversified asset pool, but internally it served as the backbone for over 80% of our leveraged holdings. The company didn't run without it. I hovered over the transfer tab. The directive allowed me to reallocate funds in the event of a breach in ethical governance. This wasn't just about Ryan's insult, it was about his pattern. The deal with the tech startup, the forced buyout, the degradation of people like Mr. Reed. But there was one technical requirement. 2 signatures were needed for a full transfer. The directive had mine, of course. The second would usually belong to the CEO, unless that CEO had unknowingly signed off on it already. In 2021, during a rushed merger with a shell-holding firm, Ryan had signed a general consent form authorizing cross-fund consolidations under my CFO authority. The clause was buried in the legalese, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. I had flagged it when the draft first came through, waited and watched. Now I selected the file, cross-referenced the approval IDs, and initiated the process. The system flagged it as valid. Transfer authorized. I closed the laptop, stood, and walked to the window. Below, the city pulsed with life, unaware of what had just shifted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even proud. I was just someone keeping a promise. The morning started with a call from Treasury. I wasn't in the loop anymore, but word travels fast when panic hits. Cole Group's primary credit line had been frozen overnight. The banks flagged irregularities in collateral coverage after the Blue Rock Fund vanished from our balance sheet. They were demanding immediate margin coverage, and without it, they would call the loans in full. It was the kind of scenario Ryan used to joke about in college as an impossible what if. By the time I arrived at the office, the atmosphere felt radioactive. Phones were ringing off the hook, department heads sprinted through hallways, and a wave of frantic energy buzzed under every surface. I didn't need a calendar to know it was Thursday, earnings prep day, the worst possible moment for a liquidity crisis. I stayed out of sight, posted in the side corridor across from the main conference room. Through the frosted glass, I watched Ryan pacing like a man trapped inside his own illusion. Natalie sat stiff, glued to her phone, likely refreshing inboxes that remained empty. At 10:03 a.m., Ryan slammed both hands on the table and called the meeting to order. Only half the board had made it in person. The rest were watching remotely, faces flickering on screens with muted expressions. Laura Peterson, the company's in-house legal counsel, stood from her seat, opened a folder, and slid a printed document across the table toward Ryan. I couldn't hear her voice, but I knew that folder. The original emergency directive. Ryan stared down at it, confused at first, then paled as he read the heading. I stepped inside without knocking. Nobody looked surprised. Laura nodded and then turned back to the room story. Cole acted within the legal authority granted to him by Henry Cole, she said. The document was notarized, witnessed, and filed. It has been legally enforceable since 2018. Ryan scoffed. This is a setup. He has no authority over current assets. That's incorrect, said a voice from the screen. David Chen, our third-party auditor, had joined the call from New York. The Blue Rock Fund was structured under long-term ethical stewardship clauses. Ethan's action was not only valid but in direct compliance with fiduciary oversight. The funds have been reallocated and the transaction is irreversible. Ryan leaned back, stunned. His usual arrogance had thinned into something brittle. Then the twist. Graham Mitchell, a longtime board member and until recently Ryan's staunchest supporter, stood up slowly. His face was red, lips tight. I backed you, Ryan. Through bad quarters, through that nonsense in Dubai, but this, you let your pride nuke the liquidity of this company. We could lose everything because you couldn't keep your ego in check over $150. Ryan tried to answer, but Graham raised his hand sharply. Step out. You've lost control. There was silence, then movement. Ryan stood fuming and stormed from the room. His footsteps echoed until the elevator doors closed. I didn't say anything. I just sat in the far corner and watched the structure bend. A minute later, Natalie's phone buzzed. She picked it up, read the screen, and her lips parted slightly. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, then turned to Laura. Our Tokyo deal. Canceled. $800 million. Laura didn't flinch. That's what happens when the foundation cracks. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. The skyline hadn't changed, but everything else had. The board reconvened that afternoon without Ryan. The motion was unanimous, 90-day suspension pending a full internal review. Natalie protested, tried to spin it as a procedural misunderstanding, but the room had shifted. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of a scandal this public. She was sidelined with polite distance, her influence evaporating by the minute. I kept to myself during the fallout. My name was on every memo, but no one asked me to speak. I suppose they thought they already knew what they needed to know, that I had struck back over an insult, pulled a financial pin out of spite. But they were wrong. It was never about humiliation. It was about erosion. Quiet erosion over years of everything we said this company stood for. Ryan found me later that week in the hallway near the elevator banks. His suit was wrinkled tie, loose eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights and whatever he was trying to drown the crisis in. He blocked my path and stared. You did all this for $150. I looked at him calm. No, I did this because you forgot who used to carry the weight of this name when no one else would. He laughed short and bitter. You think you're some kind of hero. I didn't answer. There was no point. He didn't want the truth. He wanted a villain, someone to blame. The board offered me the CEO position by the end of the week. They framed it as a natural transition, a course correction, the return of a steady hand. I declined. Instead, I restructured the $4.2 billion from Blue Rock into a reserved stabilization trust under third-party oversight. It wouldn't be touched without full board approval and only in scenarios aligned with Henry's original ethical clauses. Then I wrote my resignation. It wasn't theatrical, just a letter 2 paragraphs long. I can no longer serve in a company where silence is mistaken for compliance and legacy is traded for leverage. This place was built on restraint and responsibility. Somewhere along the line, we lost both. I hope one day they're found again. I cleared my desk that evening. No goodbyes, just a quiet elevator ride, a short walk through the snow-dusted plaza and my car waiting at the curb. 2 days later, I drove back to Springfield. The air smelled like chimney smoke and pine. Mr. Reed was waiting out front with a can of white paint and a roller already in hand. He handed me a brush without saying anything, and I dipped it into the tray. We worked side by side in silence, painting the same old wooden fence I used to ride my bike past as a kid. It took 3 hours, 2 brushes, and 1 thermos of lukewarm coffee to finish the job. When we were done, we stood back and looked at the fence. It wasn't perfect. The wood was still warped in places, the posts uneven, but it stood straight, clean, cared for. Mr. Reed didn't say much, neither did I. We didn't have to. A year passed, and by spring of 2024, the coal group had a new CEO, a figure unknown to most outside the boardroom. I kept to myself, withdrawing from headlines, accepting small invitations to consult for nonprofit funds that valued purpose over profit. It felt right to rebuild kindred trust rather than reclaim old thrones. Ryan vanished from media outlets. His social accounts went silent, interviews declined, and his public influence evaporated almost overnight. Natalie launched her own fintech startup, but whispers followed her of overreach and reputational damage. She never achieved the reach she once claimed. In early April, I received a quiet notice that Mr. Samuel Reed had passed away. It felt like the closing of a chapter I had long held open. I drove to Springfield for his funeral, a modest service in the small-town church. There was no grand memorial, no corporate sponsorship. Just a gathering of neighbors, a few old friends, and one tattered company flag from Coal Group draped modestly over a podium in the corner of the sanctuary. I walked forward and laid a single white rose atop his pine coffin. I stood in silence as the minister read prayers. Local faces I recognized: the mailman, the teacher, the old widow down the lane. Many nodded to me with quiet gratitude. It felt like more meaning in that moment than all the deals and power plays I had once endured. Afterwards, I made my way to the cemetery. As twilight deepened, I approached his grave. I knelt, my fingers brushing the cool stone. My thoughts drifted. We had never been close by blood, but by conviction. He believed in duty, he believed in honor. I whispered into the dusk that I hoped I had done right by him. I rose slowly and walked away across the grass. The wind stirred through budding trees. I left that field behind, as I always leave ghosts, without bitterness, only respect. The drive back to Chicago was quiet. The road stretched under a dusky sky, headlights, soft city lights looming ahead. My reflection looked older in the rearview mirror, but I felt lighter. At home, I sat before the fire in my living room, the memory of Grandpa Henry's voice clear. I recalled him saying that justice does not require applause. It only needs the right person to keep a promise. I nodded, though no one could see. Days later, I scheduled a final meeting with the board. The new CEO thanked me for consulting, acknowledged that the stabilization trust I had placed the $4.2 billion into was now restoring confidence. Assets were returning, deals once canceled were being reviewed under stricter ethics standards. Natalie's startup had quietly folded, and Ryan's name was a footnote in business gossip. I declined any offer to return as an executive. I told them I would remain a silent partner, a guardian of values, not a sword in a title. They accepted, and I left the boardroom once and for all. That night, I sat in my car parked outside Mr. Reed's old house in Springfield. I watched the porch light flicker on, saw the shadow of a flag still waving gently from a pole he had kept. I closed my eyes and whispered a final promise: I would never betray the kind of trust he showed me. I turned the key, the engine sounded, and I drove beneath a sky full of stars. The road stretched ahead like possibility itself. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been mocked or overlooked, hold fast to what you know is right, even when no one is watching. Because in time, justice returns quietly to those who never sold their dignity. If you found yourself moved by this story, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay with me for more stories of resilience and truth.